before we carry on with the third section of these videos, I just want to make a slight correction on the Petersham that I popped on the center front. I popped it on the 2 layers. It should only be on the Catil. I couldn't find my Petersham and I had in my head I was going to sandwich it like we did on the sides. So when you're sandwiching it, you're doing it between the Catil and the calico. And then I found my Petersham and I just carried on sewing it on the 2 layers. So just sew it on the Catil if you have the Petersham. If you don't, you can sandwich between the 2. And when you pop your bone in, decide how high you're going to have it. So probably sort of between the breasts, and you can do a little cross stitch here. So I pop my little cross stitch here, and what that does is stop your bone pushing up too far. The reason you're putting your boning channel all the way along is you've got that option. So in your fitting you can pop it in and pull it down and see where you want it to sit. Because if you put it up too high, what will happen, the bone will protrude out from the body and you'll see it. It won't sit nice on the front. So in your fitting you'll put it in and then pull it down to where you feel it sits the best. And then that's where you'd put your cross stitch. Make sure that you put your bones in all your channels before you pop your piping on the bottom. So whip stitching your seam allowance is just a single thread. Don't pull too tight because it'll tighten it right in there. Little tip, trim it just before you're going to do it, that way you don't get all the fraying. And like I was saying about curves, this back curve is only slightly ripply, so I don't really need to clip it. Another way, in Victorian times, they would have put that side forward and whip them 2 together, making sure they're even. But in our case, because this is for theatre, it's got Catil on the back and it's quite bulky, so we can't really do that. This one's, I've just left it straight and flat, and then we're going to put a bone in a casing and we're going to herringbone it to it. So on this front curve, I'm going to clip. It's still quite shallow. I could get away with not clipping, but I'd like you to see what it's like when it's done. So where I did my pre-clip before, and I did them 3/4 of an inch apart for when I sewed the curved seams together, I'm going to keep it to that. So I'm putting them together and I'm clipping exactly where they were. So if I put my seam allowances together, and I'm not doing it too deep, I'm just keeping it shallow, and I'll carry on down. So if I making sure they're like 3/4 inch each. And then I can come along and trim them. So make them like an almond shape. Make sure you got sharp scissors. So I get a nice little almond shape going on, and I'll do it on the same side, so where the little clips are. I'll work my way down. And then I would whip stitch again with the threads all along them. I've done mine in a contrasting color so that it's visible for you, but contrasting colors show every single mistake. If you do it in a similar color to your top fabric, it'll look neater and nicer. So I'm not expecting miracles your first time. Mine's not so hot, but it just takes practice. And here it is, all clipped all the way down. You can decide how far you want. I've gone with 3/4 of an inch. I think that looks quite decent. You could do them a little bit longer if you want. Shorter tends to be a lot more work. And just come and press it with the tip of your iron, literally on the tip. Yeah, don't whack your iron right in the middle, because it'll crinkle and make a mess. And then the other side, so you can see it's not pulling anywhere. So this is what I'm saying about cut them shallow. As long as they're not pulling, that's fine. If they were starting to pull, I could go a little bit deeper. So just pace yourself. Go shallow first, and then if you feel like it needs a little bit more, then you can go a little bit deeper. As long as it's not pulling. Yeah, so press it on a ham and just use the tip of your iron. And then I would come and whip stitch all that like I did the other ones. So this is the inside of one I've made previously, which was overlocked, and I've just left it because there's not much rippling there, so it doesn't show on the front. This one doesn't have piping in the seam. Yeah, so there's lots of different ways you can finish your seams off. Overlocking looks really nice. You could zigzag it on the machine, dropping the outer edge off. You could bias bind it, but then that can add bulk and you have to be careful the line doesn't show through. Or whip stitch like we're doing in this lesson. So this is my placket. I've bagged it out. I'm popping some bias binding on it, pre-folded each end. I've machined it, can hand stitch it, and iron it forward, bring it around, fold it in, and slip stitch it to the line. So if I finish that off, then I would sew it onto the back. So this is one that's made earlier, it's half finished. So I'm machining the placket, so it's peeping out about an inch on here, yeah, about an inch. So down the center back line of the bodice and sort of half and half of the placket. So I've machined that. And I've turned it over and you can see my edge. And there's the raw edge of the center back. So make sure that's shorter than the edge of the placket. If you find your layers are really bulky and this is leaving a big dip, stagger the edges like there's steps or shingles on a roof, and that will soften the edge. And then you will herringbone this down. So this is slip stitch. Slip stitching the bias binding on the edge of the placket. So you go up along the crease and go down and pick up thread just where the stitch line is. So you want to hide it and then pull it back up where you come out from, down, pick up a couple of threads. Or some people go slightly forward and do it. I prefer to go directly above and then you don't see the stitch. It's technically what I'm doing here is a ladder stitch and tailoring, but I learnt it as a slip stitch because I went to school in Canada, so I learnt that as a slip stitch. English way, they go slightly forward and then you get a little diagonal. I prefer the way I was taught. Plus, if you don't iron a hard line here, it makes it easier. If you just finger press slightly your crease, you can get your speed up. It's not as hard to get it between that hard ironed edge. It's slightly curved. It's easier. So a little tip of the day for you. And then press it. That's the other side. It'll be all right when I ironed it. So here I've finished my placket. I've sewn it on the center back line. So I pinned it in place, made sure it was even, and then I machined down the line at the back so I could keep my line straight. So now when I flip it over, I pressed it. And I can lay it down and now I can herringbone it along there. That's your placket. So the next step is we're gonna put our bias binding. So I pre-made my piped bias binding. I put a third, I've wrapped it around a third and 2/3 underneath there, so it's like a shingle on the roof, and I've pre-folded the end and I've tacked it down, and then I turn it over, so with the shorter bit underneath, the longer on top, facing on the top of my bodice. So at the base here, make sure your piping that you put into your curved seam, you've pulled it out of the way, so I've took it from the top and pulled it up. And my stitch line underneath my cord will be on my stitch line here. Yep. So I would pin them in place. So here it is pinned in place. And then you can hand tack it in place as well. You would come along and clip your selvage, all the curves, clip out V's, and then turn it up inside so you got a nice lip like that. And once you've trimmed it all, you turn it under and slip stitch it down. Just pipe the bottom for now. We're putting a Bertha on this, so we'll decide. We're going to decide later whether to pipe it the top edge or not, depending on which Bertha that you put on. So this one is piped. And a little trick that they do in theatre, they will leave the cord out at the end. You can finish it off, and you can catch it down inside underneath. That way, somebody else wears it and it's slightly bigger, you can come along, pull this cord out, and you can tighten up the neckline a little bit. So always leave a little tail, maybe not quite that long, and you can catch it under the bias binding in there, and you won't see it. So I cut out the pattern for the sleeve. This is the undersleeve. I'm just doing it in calico. Inch seam allowance on either side and half top and bottom. the top bit, that's going to be the puff. Again, inch on either side and 1/2 inch on top and bottom. So I've cut out the top puff of the sleeve in silk, and I put a gathering stitch part way here, and 2 gathering stitches here and 2 there, leaving that flat here on both sides. I've done it in pink. I didn't want to do it in the green because it's going to be visible, so I hope you can see that. My silk's a bit marked, but that's all I had. So this is the puff of the sleeve gathered out, and I'm going to mount it to the base. Right, so I've mounted the top silk onto the base of calico. I gathered it in the center first with the number 5 stitch, so halfway. I've teased the thread to the underside and tied a knot in it here, so you don't see any threads hanging out. Then I've done 2 lines of stitching across the top and bottom, stopping short these areas, keeping that smooth for the underarm. And now I pinned it into place. The excess on the front and back, this is the front, this is the back. I've pleated it up, so a couple of pleats going down, so that if this is sitting, if the pleats going down, dust won't gather in the pleats, so they're that way. Okay, now it's all tacked in place. I've just tacked it in the seam allowance all the way around. And it's ready to, I'm going to bind the top and bottom. So a bit of bias binding, catch it on the front, turn it under and bind it under, same on the top. And then I can sew these together and finish off the binding around the ends. So if you get your binding ready and leave some extra here, you can finish it off and do it neatly. So here we have it. I've machined it across. I had an inch seam allowance. And now I can lay down the rest of the bias binding. So here I've done the seam. I can overstitch that, and this is the underside. And now I can come along and finish off my bias binding top and bottom. I've finished off the seams with a bit of bias binding instead of whip stitching them. I think it looks a bit neater. And I've turned the edges. I need to slip stitch them now. And then there's your little sleeve ready to pop in. Here's the underneath of it. You can pull these secondary stitches out now where you did the gathering stitch if you want, or leave them if you don't notice them.